The point is this, that what happens here is that you see the development pre-Roman conquest of a sectarian group that hates all outsiders, believes they're all evildoers, is preparing for a messianic war, believes that everybody is either a son of light or a son of darkness, and therefore that you're predestined to be in one or the other, and furthermore has the mentality that they're always being persecuted. Now, those are a lot of the necessary ingredients for extremism, and I'll skip a few, I don't know how many, 2,000 years, and point out that many of these characteristics are shared with the Natura Carta, whom we'll come back to, because the Natura Carta ideology is a big part of the problem today. A group that we thought really was finished, but they've come back in certain ways. But in terms of Second Temple period, we get this as an example, and I assume that there are more groups of what we call apocalyptic sects, groups that expect immediate messianism, and there's going to be this complete destruction of all the wicked and only the good people are going to survive, that this kind of ideology was more common than just the Dead Sea sect for whom we have the information. That's my assumption. Now, once you make that assumption, you can understand that when the Roman period starts, again, the Romans conquered the land of Israel in 63 BCE, this whole business of sectarian ideology turns into violent revolution. You have to know as historical fact that from the day the Romans set foot in the land of Israel in 63 BCE until the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, there were always Jews revolting against the Romans. There was no period when they weren't fighting. Now let's take a look for a minute at the groups in question. So the two that we have to talk about are first the Zealots, who stem from a family that began revolting against the Romans immediately and continued right up to the year 66 of our era when the revolution began. But what's really interesting about this group is that they were political extremists from a certain point of view, because they believed that the Jews should not live under non-Jewish rule. That, by the way, was a belief of the Maccabees also, that it's like a mitzvah for Jews to live under Jewish rule. I think most of us would think that that's not a fanatical idea, that Jews should live under a Jewish government. However, right, they furthermore were willing to use violence, but even that maybe we don't think is so extreme, revolting against the Romans, who were certainly rapacious economically from the very beginning. But the most interesting group for us to look at right now is a group called the sectarian. The reason is that this group has actually given its name to the Meshuggahs of today, because these extremists call themselves, right, some form of this thing, Srikim, Sarikim, however they pronounce it. This word is based on Josephone, who is an adaptation of Josephus that circulated in the Middle Ages, that's available in Hebrew, and they obviously read about this, and they found out about the Sectarian, and they identify with it. Now, what were the Sectarian in Second Temple times? They were revolutionaries against the Romans who realized that the problem wasn't the Romans, it was the Jewish stooges of the Romans. Now, if you want to know really well about the Jewish stooges of the Romans, and you don't want to bother getting a Josephus, next time you're in a hotel, just take out that thing that says Holy Bible in the drawer. Don't tell anyone that I told you to look at it. However, if you read the story of the crucifixion, and you see the role that, at least is the way that the priests are painted there, these are the Roman stooge priests. Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of the crucifixion, was a Roman stooge. And their job was to keep the people under control and keep the pro-Roman forces in the majority, while the anti-Roman forces were revolting. Now, the point is that what the Sicarii did, and let me tell you what the name comes from. Sika is a dagger. They had these little daggers under their clothes. They went into public places, like in the temple on holidays, and they stabbed collaborator Jews. What kind of people were they? Exactly like the people who are described in the New Testament accounts of the crucifixion, because these are collaborators. Now, the point is that they were stabbing their fellow Jews. I think that this qualifies for considering to be fanaticism or extremism once you're fighting against your own people in order to bring about a revolution against a third party who's ruling over your country. Okay? Now, what's really interesting again is that this group gave its name to the people in Beit Shemesh who are now doing all these crazy things. So here's the bizarre thing, that they actually know that they're extremists, and they're identifying with extremists who kill Jews. Now, let me tell you a little about killing Jews. You know, Yigael Yadin wrote a book called Masada, the Zealot's Last Stand. It's a great book, like everything Yadin wrote. But there's only one problem. The Zealots were not at Masada. The Sectarians were. And there were a whole bunch of revolutionary groups. The Sectarians were at Masada. Now, he left out of his book a little account in Josephus, which says that the people who eventually committed suicide on Masada, and you know, it's an act of heroism, but it is a little extreme and fanatic, right? They actually went to En Gedi, and according to Josephus, they killed 750 Jewish men, women, and children in order to capture the food supplies and bring them for Masada, where they were getting ready for the final battle with the Romans. Now, this is after a revolution that had already failed, because the temple had already been destroyed. Okay? So if you want to talk about fanatical anti-Romanism, and you want to talk about somebody who is killing their own people, you got the Sectarians. Now, Yadin didn't want to mention this because he was painting Masada as the place of total heroism. You probably all know there's a debate in Israel about the meaning of Masada, especially caused not by the historical question, but by the fact that the Israeli army was using Masada as a swearing-in place before the Kotel, and parents were saying, what are you talking about? Are you trying to teach our children that if they get into trouble they should commit suicide? And Israeli parents had great objection to this. And this led itself to a whole reconsideration of the historicity, that is to say, whether it's true, the story of Masada, And there are many scholars who think that the story may not have happened the way Josephus says. I think that Josephus is telling the truth because his detail about the design of Masada is so great. And this is a whole side issue for some other lecture. But nonetheless, my point is that the fact that they went to En Gedi and killed 750 Jews so that they could fill up their stores to fight the Romans, to fight the last battle of a revolution that already failed when the temple had already been destroyed, it seems to me that's a little bit of fanatical act by them. And when we see that that name has been taken by these crazies of today, we can see why. Now, that's another very important thing to realize, that fanatics do not often deny that they're fanatics. They'll often say, I'm the only one who stands for truth. You guys don't stand for truth anymore. If you really stood for truth, you'd do X, Y, and Z. I don't want to mention it because somebody may mistakenly do it or something like that. Okay, now, therefore, when we get to talk about the lesson of the destruction of the temple, and this comes up, of course, every year in Tisha B'Av. Everybody talks about sinat chinam, baseless hatred. I know once somebody asked me about a certain person, he said he has sinat chinam for the other person, baseless hatred. I said, no, it's not baseless. If you knew what that guy did to the other guy, you know why he hates him, right? But the truth of the matter is, when the rabbis talk about baseless hatred, so all you have to do is read Josephus and read the Talmud, and you'll see that the Jewish groups were fighting among one another. And these were the revolutionary groups. And therefore, when we say that sinat chinam led to the destruction of the temple, it, to a great extent, the sinat chinam of the very revolutionary groups over who should be the head, who should be what, led to this destruction. The point that I want to make is that when you read the stories in Josephus of this infighting, and when you see the way the rabbis understood both the revolt against Rome in 66 to 73, and the other revolt against Rome, 132 to 5, the Bar Kokhba period, you'll realize why basically they were against what was, at least from that point of view at that time, this, we could call it the extreme right. Because there is a point when you move on the scale from left to right when you could end up in this type of fanatical approach, which turns out to be your own undoing. What you're doing is you're destroying your own ability to survive in the given circumstances of reality that are there, because the fanatics' reality is usually not a factor. Now, everything that we said so far is a good reason for understanding the next thing that we have to talk about, which is the way the rabbis dealt with the question of how Jews should